Hello, health champions. Today, I want to talk about your fat-burning hormones and how they are affected by fasting. So there are 4 hormones we're going to talk about. That's glucagon, it's epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, there's cortisol, and there is growth hormone, HGH, or human growth hormones. Those are the 4 that directly are involved with burning fat, meaning these are released when we're trying to generate energy. There are 3 more hormones that are super important that we need to understand because they don't burn fat directly, but they're very much related to that. And that would be insulin, it would be leptin, and ghrelin, which have to do with blood sugar control, satiety, and hunger. And the reason that we need to understand a little bit about these 7 hormones is that I want you to once and for all get past the silly notion of calories. We've heard for years that it's all about calories in, calories out. And what that means is they tell you that if you eat too many calories, you need to eat less food, less calories. And if you're overweight, it's because you're not burning enough. And how do you burn more calories? Well, you exercise. So the people who believe this, and it's both people who have had some success with weight loss and people who haven't. We've been told this so much, we believe it no matter what. And it seems so simple and so true on the surface. But I want you to forget about this once and for all. We put a big red X on it. And instead, we're going to introduce a concept that says intake must be less than usage. And now you're wondering, what am I talking about? That's exactly the same thing. No, it's not. To most people, it's going to look the same. But how can the top one be false and the bottom one be true? It's because this statement in yellow, it takes other factors into account, factors that determine your intake and your usage. So what you eat, the quality of what you eat, the type of food that you eat determines how your intake and usage changes. The when you eat, what time of day do you eat these foods and these calories, it changes everything. And the reason is that what you eat and when you eat triggers different types of hormones. And these hormones in turn become signals that regulate everything about your blood sugar, everything about your fat burning, and everything about your behavior. So it's not as simple as saying eat less, exercise more. And there are millions of people who have been made to feel guilty because they think, well, if I'm overweight, then it's because I'm eating too much and I'm not exercising enough. I'm basically a lazy, gluttonous sloth, and I should just do more, and they feel bad about themselves. But this is not about willpower. We have to understand that the quality and the timing matters. The first 2 hormones we're going to talk about is insulin and glucagon. And these 2 hormones are the primary ones involved with blood sugar regulation. And blood sugar regulation is very intimately connected to fat burning. They have a lot to do with each other. And both of these hormones are made in the pancreas in a specific area called the islets of Langerhans. And I'm just pointing this out because the body is so smart that if they have a similar or opposite function, then they're usually made in the same place so that the regulation can be coordinated that way. And there's 2 types of cells in this area, the islets of Langerhans. They're called alpha and beta cells. And you probably may have heard that insulin is made by the beta cells. Those are the cells that are attacked if you get type 1 diabetes. That's the ones that stop working. And glucagon then is made in the alpha cells. They're 2 different types of cells, but they're made in the same place. And these 2 hormones have the opposite action when it comes to regulating blood sugar. So here's a little crash course on blood sugar. It is very important for the body to maintain blood sugar in a fairly tight range. We'd like that to be maybe between 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. And anytime that you eat something, your blood sugar is going to go up. And if you eat something sugary and starchy, it's going to go up more. If you eat something with fat or protein, it's going to go up less. But in response to that blood sugar, because it's so important to keep the blood sugar in this range, because high or low blood sugar is very dangerous, has very damaging effects, then the body releases something called insulin. And when insulin rises, it brings the blood glucose down. So we get the blood sugar down, and once that blood sugar is lower, now the body backs off on the insulin. What can happen now is that if we don't eat, if we don't have good compensatory mechanisms to stabilize that blood sugar, we could overshoot a little bit, especially if we eat a bunch of processed foods. But what's supposed to happen now is that glucagon kicks in. So as insulin keeps dropping if we don't eat, now glucagon kicks in, and glucagon goes up, and glucagon now brings this blood sugar, it generates blood sugar, it stimulates the body to make blood sugar, to break it down from the stores, but also to make blood sugar from other sources called gluconeogenesis. And this is such a beautiful system that we have in the body that whenever we have a little bit of extra food, now we can put it into storage. And that's what the insulin does. We eat something, the extra gets put into storage because the insulin brings that blood sugar down, and whatever we don't need right now, we can store. And then later on, when we don't eat, when the blood sugar drops, now if there is a lack of food for a short or a long time period, now we can start using it. And that's what these hormones are all about. They can put things in storage, that's the insulin, and then these other hormones that are fat burning can retrieve them and put them to use. So we can call this storage and breakdown, and we can also call it lipogenesis or lipolysis or lipolysis, which is essentially the same thing, because when we store energy, we store it in the form of fat. So that's called lipogenesis, means making fat, and lipolysis is when we break it down. And it's hormones that do this for us, but the types of foods and when we eat, if we eat all the time or if we have fasting periods, make all the difference. So fasting will dramatically decrease the insulin and increase the glucagon, just like we see here. The yellow-orange here is the insulin, which drops when we don't eat, and when we need to retrieve these things, then the glucagon goes up. And glucagon is one of the four hormones. It's the primary one, but the others help out as well. The next fat-burning hormone is epinephrine or adrenaline. And this is the first one on the scene. It's your primary fight-flight response hormone. And it is so fast, it is available, it's released within a fraction of a second, up to a few minutes. And it's a hormone of urgency. So what it's trying to do is to generate as much energy as fast as possible. This is the hormone that makes your heart beat faster, that raises your blood pressure, that makes your hair stand on end, that dilates your pupils, that dilates your air pipes, etc., to get ready for that fight-flight response. But it's also trying to generate energy. So it's involved in glycogenolysis, which means to break down the glycogen, which is your stored carbohydrate in the body, in the muscles and the liver. But it's also trying to do it one more way, which is gluconeogenesis. So we're not just breaking down the stored glycogen, but we're also trying to make new carbohydrate, new glucose from other sources. And this hormone is trying to get energy from all sources because it's urgent. So it's also stimulating lipolysis, breaking down of fat. The other stress hormone is a little bit slower, but it's the one most people associate with stress. It's called cortisol. And if you get it in the form of a medication, it's a synthetic form called cortisone, but it's the same thing. It has the same effect on the body. And this is also with a fight-flight response, but this doesn't happen in a fraction of a second. This kicks in minutes to hours. So it's a slower acting, longer acting stress hormone. And that's why it's also associated more with chronic stress than the adrenaline is. Now, the primary function of cortisol is to raise blood sugar through gluconeogenesis, meaning making glucose from new sources. And one of those sources is protein. So if we have high levels of cortisol for a long time, such as chronic stress, now we could break down excess protein, or if we're medicated, if we're on a course, a long-term cortisone treatment, that could break down a lot of protein, and that would seem like a really bad thing. So we're going to come back and talk about that and how fasting actually affects that. And one more thing cortisol does is it decreases the uptake of glucose into the muscles. And normally muscles are one of the greatest consumers of glucose in the body. And the reason this happens is now there is more glucose available for the brain in a crisis. But of course, this happens at the expense of increasing insulin resistance, because the muscles are one of the body parts that use the most glucose and store the most glycogen. So by decreasing the supply to the muscles, now we're really increasing overall blood glucose and insulin resistance, because that glucose has fewer places to go. And that would also seem like a bad thing, right? Because if we're increasing insulin resistance, now we're increasing weight gain. So we're going to talk about in just a second, but the reason I'm covering this in so much detail is that you're going to hear these arguments from other people that fasting causes increases cortisol and therefore these are bad things, but it's not necessarily so. Fasting also increases growth hormone tremendously, and this is another fat-burning hormone. It stimulates lipolysis. It stimulates the breakdown of fat because it's trying to generate energy for the body. But in addition to stimulating the breakdown of fat, it also inhibits the fat cells from taking up, from storing more. So it works at it from two different directions. And just like the name says, growth hormone stimulates growth. It stimulates protein synthesis, and therefore it is protein sparing. It's muscle sparing. It decreases the tendency to use muscles for gluconeogenesis. And growth hormone also has a slight anti-insulin effect, meaning it decreases insulin sensitivity. And again, that would seem like a bad thing. If you decrease insulin sensitivity, you increase insulin resistance, and therefore you increase glucose short term at least. And how does fasting affect hunger? Because that's what people are afraid of. They don't like being afraid, so they don't want to fast. But we're going to understand this in just a minute. There is something called leptin. That's a hormone that signals satiety. So when you eat, that food goes into the cells, and these cells send out the hormone leptin that says, we are full, we're satisfied, we've had enough, you can stop eating. But if you have something called insulin resistance, if your cells are overfed because we've fed them too much glucose and we've had too much insulin push this glucose into the cell for a long period of time, these cells become resistant. Now you can also develop another type of resistance to the hormone leptin. So now the cells are full, they're signaling with leptin that they've had enough, but when you're leptin resistant, you don't get the message. So you keep eating even though you're supposed to get the message that you're full. So with fasting, we can reduce the insulin resistance and therefore reduce the leptin resistance. And if we start responding appropriately to leptin, we can actually balance and control our hunger better. So long-term, fasting doesn't actually lead to more hunger. It leads to less or more balanced responses to hunger. And kind of the opposite of that is called ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. Whenever you don't eat, such as in fasting, then ghrelin is released and you get hungry. So we're going to come back to this in just a second and clear that up. So some of these effects that we've talked about seem like they might be bad effects if we don't understand them properly. And this is what's often pointed out by people who try to scare you away from fasting, even though so many people are getting great results. So between the three of them, cortisol, adrenaline, and human growth hormones, they increase gluconeogenesis, they increase blood sugar, they increase the breakdown of stored carbohydrates. So all in all, this raises blood sugar. We've also seen that because of this gluconeogenesis, you could increase your protein breakdown and you could increase your hunger from the hormone ghrelin when you don't eat. So let's try to understand this and make it really simple. There is one hormone that regulates blood sugar down, and then there are 4 hormones that regulate it up. So it's not like you have to eat all the time to control your blood sugar. Eating is not the only way to bring it up. You have 4 hormones to do that. So insulin is the one that's going to bring it down. And then the others that we talked about, the glucagon, the epinephrine, the cortisol, and the growth hormone are all going to bring it up. So let's bring all this together here. We have the glucose that we know needs to be maintained in a very narrow band. And when glucose goes up, then insulin rises to bring it back down. So here is the insulin. And then when we don't eat, as long as we don't add any new food, then the insulin will basically keep falling, keep dropping, because there's no reason to produce a lot of insulin. You produce a tiny bit to maintain baseline levels of blood glucose, but you're not putting any new food in that needs massive amounts to process. And then glucose is going to drop a little bit, but then because of these other hormones, the glucagon, the cortisol, epinephrine, and growth hormone, it's going to find a baseline and maintain itself. So a couple of things we need to keep in mind is normally we talk about things that raise blood sugar as a bad thing because people usually have too much. But here we're just talking about these 4 hormones that compensate, that bring the blood sugar back up to normal where it's supposed to be. So it's not excess blood sugar, it just brings it up to that baseline where it needs to be. The other key that we need to understand in terms of fat burning is that as long as glucose is high, we're not really going to burn fat. As long as insulin is high, we're not going to burn fat because carbs have to be burned first, and as long as insulin is high, it is a storage hormone. It prevents fat burning. But when we start getting normal blood glucose levels and we're getting insulin levels below our previous baseline, now we switch from primarily burning carbs to primarily burning fat. But if we never do any fasting, then it's very difficult to get to this point. If we keep just putting food in, if we keep eating every 2 hours, then we're never really going to get this drop, and we're only going to burn the new food that we put in instead of burning the fat off the body. Another thing I find interesting is that these 4 hormones that raise blood sugar, the glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone, they're called counter-regulatory. So we're talking about blood sugar regulation, but then they call these 4 counter-regulatory, as if insulin was the only normal regulatory hormone, as if the only concern we would ever have was to bring blood glucose down. So that naming convention, I think, is a little humorous because it shows how out of balance we've gotten with this, with the storage and usage, that for the last 100 years, we've only been storing. We never get back to using, which happens when we fast. So I think historically, we've actually been using the 4 counter-regulatory hormones much more, meaning during a fast, when they kick in, that's the normal state. That's what we had most of during our history. But now let's build on this and talk about protein breakdown and see how that would fit in. Is that really a problem? So we talked about how during fasting, cortisol goes up, which can break down protein, break down muscle tissue in some cases. But we also said that growth hormone goes up that can offset that. So what does that look like, and is it really a problem? So if we draw these two hormones onto a graph and we compare, then we see that cortisol is there to raise blood sugar, right? So cortisol is going to rise initially because when we stop eating, we need to support glucose. However, there comes a point here where we said we switched from primary carb burning to primarily fat burning. And when we're primarily fat burning, now we don't need so much blood glucose anymore. We don't rely on gluconeogenesis because we're burning fat. So now cortisol can come back down. So the increase is very temporary when we're fasting. However, we are starting off with growth hormone at a certain level, but growth hormone doesn't level off for a long while. Growth hormone keeps going up for days, and maybe after 5 to 7 days, it levels off. So what this means is cortisol has a temporary increase and then it levels off. The growth hormone that compensates for muscle loss keeps going up. So the effect of muscle preservation, of muscle saving, is much stronger than the cortisol effect. So the net effects of fasting is that short term, you're going to get a little bit hungry. Your ghrelin is going to go up. But what happens is ghrelin is mostly an habitual hormone. It's going to get released when you typically eat. And if you don't eat and ignore it, you have a cup of tea, then it's going to back off. And long term, your ghrelin is going to decrease. It doesn't mean it goes away. It doesn't mean you never get hungry again. It just means that you're not going to have a constant high level of ghrelin. And with some fasting, you probably get much better balanced responses to hunger. When it comes to cortisol, just like we said, it will go up initially, but as soon as you don't rely primarily on glucose, but you rely more on fat and ketones, now your cortisol will start dropping. It's not going to go away, but you're going to get better at normalizing cortisol. As your insulin drops, like we saw here, you're going to dramatically improve your insulin sensitivity and reduce your insulin resistance. And that is also going to dramatically increase your fat burning, and with lower insulin levels, now you're going to have one more way to contribute to weight loss. And since insulin resistance is the #1 cause of degenerative disease, as you become more insulin sensitive, you're going to dramatically decrease your risk of degenerative disease, which includes type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, hypertension, high blood pressure, and even dementia. And as if that wasn't enough, fasting can even provide you with some anti-aging and immune benefits. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.